to The Pointy End. I'm Keith Sutherland. Today my guest is PEIanTulloch, political commentator from La Trobe. Welcome.
Good morning, Keith.
We've got a lot to discuss today because there's been a lot of machinations going on, whether there will be an election before the budget, whether it'll be later in the year, as Malcolm Turnbull has said. What's your thoughts on that, whether it'll go early or late, and then we'll talk about how it's going to happen, whether it's going to be a trigger or whether there's going to be a double dissolution. But yeah, what's your thought about an early election?
Well, my initial inclination was that it'll be later in the year, perhaps September or October. But there's a lot of indications that it may be called in late April or early May. It has to be called before, I think, the 11th of May, 6 months before the Parliament would usually end. So you can't have a double dissolution after then, so it's got to be called before then. There are two triggers in place: the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Bill, which has been rejected twice by the Senate, and the Fair Work Union Governance legislation, which has been rejected twice by the Senate. So Malcolm Turnbull's got two triggers. Whether he wants to run on...
They're not sort of strong enough triggers, though, are they? Because people don't quite understand that, whereas they'll understand the Royal Commission stuff.
They were rejected a long time ago.
That's right.
But he hasn't got time to get another trigger up because Parliament sits for the first time on the 2nd of February, only for a few days, and then doesn't set to go until the end of February. He needs a bill to be rejected, say the ABCC bill, to be rejected twice in 3 months, and he just simply hasn't got time to do that.
And that's his argument, that he'd like to get into Parliament earlier this year and put up the legislation, and no doubt it probably will be rejected. There's no doubt that Labor would oppose to it, and possibly the Greens, but whether he can get the crossbench senators to approve it. But yeah, as you said, it's going to be quite a while, so that can't really be his trigger. But you looked at Scott Morrison and Arthur Sinodonis were saying that they'd like to go early. Tony Nutt, the new director for the Liberal Party, is saying no, go your full term, and there's some other powerful people saying the same. So there's a bit of pressure on him from all sides, really.
There is. I'm quite certain if he went early that he would win, given the situation if the public opinion polls are truly representative of voters' intentions. I'm absolutely certain that he would win. If he goes later in the year, he's got to get a budget through. There's a lot of stuff happening with the Peter Dutton inquiry. So it's more precarious if he goes later in the year. I think he'll win if he goes early. But there are some factors, I think, like why would Tony Nutt, the federal director, be saying we'll go the full term? Turnbull said he'll go the full term. People don't like early elections.
And they really don't, that's for sure.
But given his standing in the polls.
And it's been interesting with the latest Morgan poll that came out, that it's 56-44 on two-party preferred. But the one that really staggered me was in Victoria, that the Liberal Party is sort of marginally in front in Victoria. I would have thought that Daniel Andrew is doing a good job. Matthew Guy doesn't seem to be doing very much at all. He's typical opposition, knocking everything. But Victoria, the stronghold was for Labor in Victoria, seems to be dissipating, and I can't really imagine why that would be happening.
Well, it's interesting. I think Turnbull's small L Liberal credentials fit a really good profile for the Liberals in Victoria. So no, I'm not surprised at that at all. Whether it will influence the next state election, that's 3 years away.
Yeah,
so,
I don't expect it's guaranteed by that time.
I don't, and there's a long time.
It certainly is.
A long time to go, but if there's an early election in Victoria, it means really marginal seats like Corangamite will probably be retained by
well, she's worked very hard, and now with the bushfires, been everywhere down that way.
And there's a couple of marginal seats in that Labor hold too in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, which might be in jeopardy too if those polls hold up.
And that's interesting because there's all the arguments about the east-west, whether it's right and wrong, but anyway. And there's been all the terminology just before Christmas with getting rid of the rubbish with Jamie Briggs, and Malcolm Turnbull had been sitting on that for over a month. And then, of course, Mel Brough, within half an hour of each other, announcing that they're stepping down, etc. But and then Peter Dutton goes and puts his foot in it again. But they seem to me, and I argued this with Dennis last week on our head-to-head, seems to be two sets of rules. Peter Dutton gets away with what's been said, you know, the comments, the text and so on. Jamie Briggs has to fall on his sword, but Malcolm can't be seen to be kicking too many of Tony's supporters out because he needs obviously that level of right-wing support within his own party.
I think that's exactly right. I think Scott Morrison was instrumental in keeping Dutton in the ministry when Malcolm Turnbull took over as Prime Minister.
Okay.
Because I think he was inclined to demote him to the backbench. So, but given those comments, I think it is hypocritical of the Prime Minister not to get rid of him. But I think he's got no choice. There's got too much support by the right-wing faction in the parliamentary party for him to be dumped. And what Malcolm Turnbull doesn't want is even more ructions amongst the group that he effectively demolished when he took over from Tony Abbott.
Yeah, because he's in a very difficult position. The other thing that makes me think that they'll probably go to an earlier election is because of the budget. There was all those pre-election promises from Tony Abbott, Joe Hockey in 2013 that, yes, we're going to balance the budget within the first 12 months, we're going to do this, we're going to bring it back. The budget's now in disarray. And it was going, when they took over, I think from memory, it was about $178 billion budget deficit. In the next 4 years, it's predicted to go to $558 billion on Scott Morrison's MyEFO, the last figures. So there's all sorts of troubles there. The promises they made, they haven't been able to keep. We won't cut the ABC, we won't cut health, they've cut everything. So they've got to try and justify that, this being the last year of a giveaway budget, but they really can't give away when they've got those terrible, disastrous figures.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? If you analyse the polls, it looks like the economic circumstances of the country have had almost no influence on Malcolm Turnbull's standing. So one could argue that, okay, he introduces a budget, sure, there's a promise in the never to restore it to surplus. But the issue about the budget deficit has almost disappeared out of the political lexicon.
Totally.
But given the quite disastrous circumstances, there is, and they talk about the GST, some state leaders favour it and some don't. I think if we go to an early election, it'll be fought on trade union power versus, I suppose Bill Shorten will be talking about the GST and issues like that.
With the Labor Party, it's interesting, Jason Clare's coming to town in a couple of weeks' time. And I believe he's coming on the PEIan program, so that'll be really good to talk about communications, and because he's probably a bit of an heir apparent, I would think so, to Shorten. There's no doubt in my mind that Shorten will lead him to the election, and as you said, I think, and I agree with you, that they'll probably lose that next election because of the popularity of Turnbull and the unpopularity of Shorten himself. But then they're going to have to start to look for who's going to be the next one. It's either Mark Butler, in my opinion, or Jason Clare, Tanya Plibersek. I would like to think so, but I don't think they're going to be game and have another female because of what happened last time around. But let's bring back to the female on the local level. Now we've got Elise Chapman standing for the One Nation, Pauline Hanson's One Nation. Now everyone says to me, oh, she hasn't got a hope in hell. My argument is that she probably has got a fairly good chance when you consider the Motor Enthusiast Party gets in 0.02%. There's no doubt that One Nation's going to get probably 2, maybe 3%. If they can get the preference flow, I reckon she's got a very good chance of winning. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, if it's a double dissolution, she only needs 7.7% of the primary vote compared to 14.4% if it was a normal election held later in the year. So if there's a double dissolution, she'd have a much stronger chance if she does the preference deals with the other right-wing minor fringe parties. She's got a chance, but if it's a normal election, I don't think she could get up to 14.4, even with those preference deals, despite what's happened in the past with some of those minor parties. I think, for example, there'll be a lot of pressure on the Liberals to put One Nation last, so they won't get a fraction of a quota from the Liberals. I think that would be really damaging for One Nation. And remember, One Nation has been least popular in Victoria and South Australia compared to Queensland and New South Wales, for example.
But bring it back to Liz Chapman's anti-mosque, and there's a fair sentiment out in the community, not just in Bendigo, even though we've appeared prominently on all the news services, unfortunately. But there's that sentiment out there, anti-refugees, which is falling into the rednecks in our society that don't want this sort of thing. We see the backlash in Germany at the moment and all these sorts of things. But as you mentioned about the double dissolution, as I understand it, the chance they've got has to be either June the 4th or June the 11th, because it has to be no later than 6 months from November the 11th. So the double dissolution is a point, but then they have to go to a budget. So maybe they bring the budget in, a decent budget, a kind giveaway one, and then perhaps say, all right, we're going to election now. So that's the only way. But having said that, then the minor parties are going to get back in. And of course, the government doesn't want minor parties in, and their legislation to change all that is a long way off, I would have thought.
And they had the opportunity. Labor and the Greens did support changing the rules for the Senate elections. There's a number of ways of doing it. You could, for example, say that if a party gets less than 4%, which is the cut-off in terms of getting the deposit back for a candidate, your preferences don't get distributed. That would easily solve that problem for the major parties. And the Greens would benefit from that as well.
Of course they would, yeah.
But it would, and the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, in my view, should have got together a long time before now and tried to do something like that. But that legislation would have got through the Senate, with the Greens and the Labor Party and the Liberals supporting it.
Do you see any sleeper issues that are coming up? We've seen Gonski not being funded for the last 2 years. Climate change is going to be on the agenda because they came out of it with Paris okay, but really the rest of the world is doing a lot more than what we're doing. Education versus public schools, more money going into private schools, and you've got health funding as always. That's the evergreen that's always there and never sufficient funding. But is there any other sleeper issues that you see other than you mentioned about the trade union and the ABCC, which is legislation that's got to be brought to Parliament? But obviously it'll be union bashing after the Royal Commission, because you wouldn't go and spend $40 to $80 million on a Royal Commission not to try and benefit in an election. But is there anything else other than those ones?
I think tax is really important. The tax mix, a lot of transnational, multinational companies paying no tax at all through transfer pricing arrangements where they make their profits in a low tax country. I think that could be an issue for Labor to pursue. The GST is always bubbling along, of course, as an issue. But I think the major issues in any election are employment issues, education and health. Remember, in the first hockey budget, $80 billion was taken out of health and education from the states. That's why some of the states are almost desperate
to go for the 5% increase on GST, of course.
And even to broaden the base.
Yeah. Finally, bring it back to the local level again. Lisa Chester's, and we don't know who the Liberal Party candidate's going to be at this stage. I wouldn't think it's going to be Greg Bickley again, but have you got any thoughts on who may be, or are there any suggestions? I've heard nothing about who it might be, because I think they're going to be hard pressed to defeat Lisa. She's everywhere, working really hard, and she's got a fairly high profile out there in the community and also doing very well in Parliament these days.
Yeah, I think I've heard around the traps that Bickley may not stand again. He's a perennial candidate, state and federal. I think I've also heard that they might bring someone from outside in, but that's fraught with danger because if the person's not a high-profile local person, it would work against the Liberals. So I think they're really struggling to find an ideal candidate, because they need to be high-profile. In my view, they need to be local. They need to have some standing in the community. They need to be known in the community. And I think they're really struggling to find that person.
Well, Ian, as always, it's great to get your knowledge and understanding of politics and how it all works, the machinations. So looking forward to working with you, with Dennis and myself this year, because big year with politics coming up. We've got the council elections, but federal politics, it's going to be a great year. So we'd like to have you more often and as leading up to the election, whether it be early, whether it be later in the year. But thank you once again for appearing on the program today.
Thanks very much, Keith.
Thank you.